Old Grognard says, let's learn how the languages skill works in D6 Star Wars 2nd Edition. Unlike some other games, in D6 Star Wars there isn't a language proficiency system like there is in, say, Dungeons & Dragons. There isn't even a hard and fast rule for how many languages a character starts with. That's left up to the GM. Instead, this game has the languages skill. The languages skill is used when a character is trying to understand or speak a language in which they aren't fluent. They can also use it to learn new languages. This is a good thing, since in the movies there are a lot of characters who don't speak Basic for a variety of reasons. It's also good because it allows us to have stats for a protocol droid without having to write down all of its 6 million forms of communication. How this works is that when a character encounters a language in which they aren't fluent and want to know what's being said, the player, or GM in the case of NPCs, rolls the die code for their languages skill. If they don't have any dice in the skill, they use their knowledge attribute instead. The difficulty of a languages skill check is based on the complexity of what's being said and how familiar the language is. The rulebook uses similarity to Basic as a starting point. However, it's common for the GM to use whatever language the character is fluent in that is most similar to the language in question. This way, if the language in question is a dialect of Shirwook, and Chewbacca is trying to understand it, it would have the difficulty based on how similar the language is to Shirwook instead of Basic. The base difficulty chart looks like this. You can substitute the name of the language being used to determine difficulty for where it says Basic, like in the Chewbacca example from earlier. There are also modifiers based on the complexity of what's being said, and they range from a +10 to the character's roll for something simple, to a +20 to difficulty for really complex ideas. Everything so far has been about understanding what someone else is trying to communicate. If a character tries to speak or communicate in a language in which they lack fluency, the difficulty goes up by 2 levels. This usually means a +10 to the difficulty. This might explain why in Universe you have characters having conversations in 2 different languages. Maybe Luke understands Jawa just fine but can't speak it, and the inverse might be true for the Jawas when it comes to Basic. So how characters become fluent in new languages is that there are certain times where the character attempts a languages check that has a difficulty of at least difficult as determined by the GM. If they're successful, the player will write down the name of the language and put a hash mark next to it somewhere on their character sheet. Each time they are successful at one of these checks, they add another hash mark. When they finally reach 10 hash marks, they are fluent in the language. In Episode 6, C-3PO does something like this when he meets the Ewoks and does it fairly quickly. In game terms, why he's able to do this is that according to the Star Wars sourcebook, C-3PO has a languages skill of 12D as of the Battle of Yavin, and probably even higher by the Battle of Endor. This means his average roll would be a 42. Since this game uses the same difficulty scale as 5e when making skill checks, to give you some perspective, this would be equivalent to a D&D character having +31 or 32 to their roll when attempting something. So succeeding on 10 difficult languages checks wouldn't take him very long at all. The last thing I'll cover is how specializations work with languages. Specializations in language work pretty much like specializations in other skills, except if a character has a specialization in a language of 5D or more, they are considered fluent. If they encounter a language that is more similar to their specialization than their other languages, they can use the specialization to roll instead of their main languages skill. That pretty much covers how the languages skill works in D6 Star Wars 2nd Edition. Thanks for watching. Ensign McClunky and I would like to wish you a wonderful rest of your day.